long before the age of Godfrey's first triumphs and Marika's radiant reforms, the lands between harboured a presence older than blessing, older than grace, and far older than any lineage that would later claim divine authority. Hidden beneath the foundations that would one day support Leyndell, buried under strata of stone, sorrow, and forgotten lore, the earliest seeds of frenzy existed as murmurs in places that saw no sunlight. In those shadowed caverns, the voices of the imprisoned merchants reverberated through hollow passages, their laments circling the darkness long before the Erdtree rose to dominate the horizon. These ancient songs, half prayer, half curse, were the first movements of a power that would eventually take the form of a burning madness, a flame that cared nothing for order, lineage, or cosmic hierarchy. To understand the origins of this force, we must first remember that the world of the Golden Order was built on exclusions. Marika's reforms reshaped reality, sculpting law into light and declaring one shape of truth to be the foundation on which all lives must rest. Her vision was unwavering, clear, and severe. Yet every law carves a shadow, and every truth leaves something unspoken beneath it. In that hidden remainder, the rejected, the forgotten, the silenced, the frenzied flame found its earliest refuge. It did not arise as a deliberate counter-order, nor as the rebellious invention of mortals seeking liberation. It manifested through suffering that had no witness, and because that suffering was buried too deeply for daylight compassion, it fermented into something hotter, sharper, and infinitely more desperate. The nomadic merchants, whose music carried memories of wandering and wide horizons, were among the first to be caught in the tightening strictures of the rising Golden Order. Theirs was a culture that embraced movement, impermanence, and the gentle weaving of community across the ever-changing territories of the lands between. But as Marika's design hardened, it demanded not only obedience, but uniformity. The merchants' freedom of path, freedom of trade, and freedom of thought became caricatured as threats to unity. Under suspicion of treachery, catastrophe followed, mass imprisonment, entombment, and collective despair in the depths beneath Leyndell. Their voices, suppressed but not extinguished, bent and merged in that grave of stone, forming a chorus that no human throat had ever intended to produce. It was from this crucible of grief and injustice that the frenzied flame first stirred with direction. The collective anguish of the merchants did not remain passive. The pressure of their confinement transformed it. As their songs blended and intensified, the music reshaped itself into a single, cohesive force. Something that demanded witness, demanded release, and demanded that the same pain inflicted upon them be brought forth into the world so all beings could feel, understand, and at last acknowledge the truth of suppressed suffering. This was not revenge in the conventional sense. It was the yearning of despair to be seen, and when such longing finds no answer, it burns. The earliest stories of frenzy recall a yellowing heat, a light that did not comfort, but overwhelmed. A warmth that pressed inward until the boundary between self and world began to dissolve. In these accounts, madness is not a distortion of perception, but the removal of partitions separating one soul from another. Frenzy arises not from illusion, but from a sudden and catastrophic clarity. A realization that individual identity, cherished and protected as the core of mortal experience, is an invention woven from fear, habit, and isolation. It is said that to glimpse this truth is to feel every sorrow ever contained by all beings, to know every hurt that was ever hidden. No mortal mind can bear that burden without breaking, and so the flame takes the pieces and arranges them into a new form, one that does not resist unity, one that welcomes dissolution into a whole that stretches beyond any single life. In later ages, when explorers stumbled upon inscriptions depicting the pulse of frenzy beneath the earth, they interpreted the flame as a force of pure destruction. Yet such interpretations missed the core of its nature. Destruction was never its aim. The frenzied flame sought communion, total communion, unrestricted by the illusions of separateness, rank, or divine decree. It yearned for a world where suffering could no longer be hidden, because there would be no other in which to hide it. The madness it wielded was not the madness of chaos, but of convergence, the collapse of distance between all beings into a single collective awareness. But because mortals cling to the self as fiercely as they cling to breath itself, the experience of unity felt like unbearable dissolution, and thus what could have been transcendence manifested as torment. Over centuries, the Golden Order grew, flourished, and solidified into the structure known across the lands between. Yet, even as the great boughs of the Erdtree cast light upon every kingdom, the murmurs below persisted. The three fingers, manifestations of Frenzy's collective will, took form deep beneath the capital. They extended themselves not as rulers, but as beckoning guides, offering a release from the weight of mortal suffering through a path entirely separate from grace. To touch them was to forfeit individuality, but also to shed the chains of identity that bound every being to despair. If Marika's grace raised champions to maintain order, the frenzied flame sought vessels who would embrace communion beyond the constraints of the self. Throughout this earliest period, frenzy whispered to only a few, and those who heard the call were often seen wandering alone across the wilderness, laughing at nothing visible, sobbing at the wind, or singing melodies that echoed the lost cadences of the imprisoned merchants. Such wanderers were not driven mad by delusion, but by the slow bleeding of boundaries that had once maintained their sense of separateness. They felt the suffering of strangers as if it were their own. They could not distinguish their own memories from those of voices they had never heard physically. In their unraveling minds lived the earliest attempts of the frenzied flame to share its truth, to bridge the chasm between solitary lives. What followed next would reshape the destiny of frenzy itself. For even though the Golden Order built its shining capital above those early murmurs, the buried cries did not fade. They reverberated, growing denser and more resonant, shaping themselves into a force that remained patient even as centuries passed. When the world above fractured, when demigods fell to ambition and kingdoms collapsed under their own weight, the conditions became ripe for frenzy to ascend from shadow into significance. But that moment and the strange paths that led mortals toward the three fingers belong to the next chapter of this descent, where madness becomes prophecy and sorrow becomes flame. In the centuries that followed the first murmurs beneath Leyndell, the world above blossomed into the luminous architecture of Marika's sacred design. The Erdtree towered over all kingdoms, its branches casting a measured radiance that reached even the most distant shorelines. Armies marched beneath its shimmering canopy. Scholars codified its doctrines in halls draped with gold. Even the wind seemed to move in deference to the order that sustained the lands between. Yet the deeper foundations of this radiant empire rested upon fault lines too old, too wounded, and too saturated with grief to bear the weight forever. And so, without ever being acknowledged, the frenzied flame continued to simmer beneath these structures, an uninvited witness to every triumph of the Golden Order, every proclamation of unity, every quiet act of erasure that smoothed the edges of the world into something Marika deemed ideal. The laws that governed the Order were not merely political or spiritual. They were metaphysical, carved into the very fabric of existence. Grace flowed through chosen vessels, elevating some above the rest. The Elden Ring, with its interlocking runes and elegant constraints, structured reality so thoroughly that even the cycles of death answered to its hand. But for all its refinement, the Golden Order possessed a flaw as fundamental as stone resisting the tide. Its perfection required silence from those who did not fit its vision. And so, generation after generation, small pockets of humanity were pressed further into the margins. Wanderers, heretics, outcasts, and the forgotten merchants whose laments had birthed the earliest rumblings of frenzy. What the Order called harmony was, for many, a slow suffocation. And the Frenzied Flame, born from this quiet injustice, continued to accumulate every whispered sorrow. To understand why such sorrow could ignite into a power capable of rivaling the divine, we must look to the nature of suffering in the lands between. Pain did not vanish through grace. It merely lost the right to speak. The Golden Order prized clarity, lineage, and continuity. It had little tolerance for memories that wandered too far afield from Marika's grand narrative. Those who bore wounds that did not align with the ordained structure found themselves stranded in a world that preferred their invisibility. Among these lost souls were the descendants of the nomadic merchants, whose songs and stories had once moved freely across nations before being locked away beneath the capital. Though their voices had been stilled, the resonance of their grief endured. It seeped through the stone corridors, gathering in corners where torchlight never reached, nurturing a fire that understood suffering not as a flaw, but as a truth deeper than any sanctioned blessing. There were early signs of Frenzy's return, but they were misunderstood by most. Wanderers encountered lone figures in the night, strangers who trembled with laughter and tears at the same time, their eyes reflecting a golden shimmer that wavered like candlelight, caught between brilliance and ruin. Farmers found patterns of scorched grass spiraling outward from footprints that did not belong to any living creature. Shepherds reported hearing songs carried across empty fields at dusk, melodies layered with harmonies no single voice could produce. These phenomena were neither miracles nor curses. They were echoes, reverberations of the collective anguish still pulsing beneath Leyndell, the sorrow that refused to remain buried. As the Erdtree's influence expanded, so did Marika's ambition. Her partnership with Radagon, her interventions in divine lineage, and her reshaping of the Elden Ring created a world where law became inseparable from identity. Every mortal was expected to reflect a fragment of the Order, embodying its structure, its moral clarity, its unwavering devotion. But identity defined by divine decree leaves little room for the fractures that naturally form in the human heart. Grief remains grief, no matter how brightly grace may shine. And the frenzied flame, attuned to every abandoned sorrow, grew stronger with each life that found no space within the Order to hold its pain. Over time, the imprisoned merchants became more than victims of injustice. They became vessels of a shared consciousness that blended their despair into something immense and unified. It is said that as their minds unraveled, their souls intertwined, forming a single cry so profound that it pierced the boundaries separating mortal emotion from cosmic principle. This cry did not rise upward in prayer. It collapsed inward, folding upon itself until it became a philosophy of its own, a truth born from suffering rather than sanctioned decree. The frenzied flame, in its earliest form, was not a god, nor a principle, nor even a coherent entity. It was the combined memory of pain seeking a way to be understood. And as it matured, it discovered that understanding could only come through the shared experience of all beings. This desire for shared experience is essential to the madness that would eventually define frenzy. To the three fingers, the world's divisions were illusions, constructs perpetuated by those who feared vulnerability. To feel another being's pain was not a burden, but a bridge. To dissolve the boundaries between self and other was not annihilation, but communion. Yet because mortals are shaped by their individuality, the experience of forced unity appears as terror. Madness, then, is not the essence of frenzy, but the mortal reaction to the truth it reveals. That existence is not as separate, not as isolated, and not as individual as the Golden Order insists. As the frenzied flame began to crystallize into a coherent will, it took on three manifestations. The three fingers. These were not avatars in the sense of the greater will's envoys. They were conduits, extensions of the collective anguish that had merged into the flame. They reached outward slowly, tentatively, touching the minds of those whose suffering resonated closely with their own. Among the first to answer were wanderers who had lost family to persecution, scholars disillusioned by the Erdtree's uncompromising doctrines, and warriors haunted by the lives they had taken in the name of unity. These individuals did not seek chaos. They sought release from guilt, from grief, from the relentless burden of individuality. The capital, however, remained unaware. Leyndell basked in its golden glory, unaware that beneath its marble floors and gilded statues, the foundation of Marika's dream was slowly fracturing under the weight of buried sorrow. Beneath the royal capital, where even the Erdtree's roots struggled to reach, the corridors leading toward the three fingers remained untouched by grace. They pulsed instead with an ancient heat, the warmth of too many emotions compressed into a single space. In those depths, the flame waited with patience, born not of strategy, but of helplessness. It had no power to ascend until someone chose to descend. It was during this period that the nature of frenzy began to shift. What had once been a silent accumulation of anguish became a deliberate expression of unmaking. The flame did not seek revenge against Marika or the Erdtree. It sought to dismantle the structures that prevented beings from sharing their suffering freely. The Golden Order prized separation between mortal and divine, ruler and subject, blessed and forsaken. The frenzied flame rejected all such divisions, insisting that the world's fractures were the source of all anguish. If unity required burning the distinctions away, then it would burn. Yet frenzy's path was not a declaration of war. It was a plea disguised as destruction. The three fingers did not call for the lands to be reduced to cinders. They called for the dissolution of isolation. The fire they wielded did not consume flesh through heat, but through revelation. It overwhelmed the mind with the totality of collective suffering, forcing the self to dissolve into the whole. This dissolution was liberation to those who embraced it and torment to those who resisted. Over generations, the merchant's legacy survived through stories shared in hushed tones among wandering traders and forgotten families. Their songs, though fragmented, still carried the same haunting intervals, the same sorrow that once shaped the flame below. People spoke of a strange warmth rising from the depths, a heat that felt neither comforting nor hostile, but strangely familiar, as though it reached towards something long buried in every heart. And so the stage was set. The Golden Order stood unshaken above ground, while below it, a force, equal in depth, but opposite in nature, waited for the faintest sign of recognition. All it required was one mortal willing to heed its call, not as a servant, not as a champion, but as a witness to the truth the world had refused to see. Deep beneath the glittering avenues of Leyndell, beyond the reach of torches carried by even the bravest explorers, lies a chamber untouched by prayer, unlit by grace, and unclaimed by any divine authority of the Golden Order. This is the site of the buried temple, the place where the cries of the imprisoned merchants first crystallized into something more than anguish, something more than a grievance against the world that condemned them. It was here, in this subterranean vault where the ceiling seemed to have been carved by trembling hands, and the walls echo with layered harmonics of sorrow, that the frenzied flame first gathered the shape of intention. And from that intention emerged the three fingers, not as rulers or prophets, but as the physical embodiment of suffering that refused to disappear. The location of this hidden temple is no accident. When Marika and Radagon wove the Golden Order into the very structure of existence, they sealed away vast networks of catacombs, ossuaries, and forgotten ruins, places that predated the Erdtree's rise. These chambers, soaked in the memories of older ages, resisted the encroachment of grace. While the Erdtree's roots spread across continents, the deepest places remained untouched, retaining the language of grief spoken long before unity became law. Here, the imprisoned merchants were entombed, not because they posed a threat of rebellion, but because they carried songs that reminded the world of its fragility, of its recesses of emotion that could not be polished into order. Their imprisonment was total. The air was thin, the darkness absolute. Their cries, though, were uncontainable. They wound through stone corridors like threads of gold aflame, gradually intertwining until they formed a single voice, impossibly layered, impossibly full. This voice did not speak in words. It spoke in raw emotion, outrage, longing, despair, and an aching yearning for freedom that no mortal body could hold. And from this ocean of blended emotion rose a force that was not quite living and not quite divine. The frenzied flame came into the world not with fire and explosion, but with a whisper that shook the boundaries of the self. The three fingers manifested slowly, gradually. They were not born as statues or spirits or blazing phantoms. They emerged as tendrils of living flame, coiling together like strands of molten emotion seeking escape. Their form resembled fingers only because mortals instinctively seek familiarity in the unfamiliar. But theirs was a shape born of agony, a gesture reaching outward, as if offering the chance to grasp something, anything, that might soothe the unbearable weight of shared sorrow. These fingers were the flame's invitation, its plea to connect, to be understood, to be held after lifetimes of abandonment. As the three fingers took form, the architecture of the buried temple shifted. Walls pulsed as if breathing. Stones softened and twisted into shapes resembling half-finished carvings of faces, mouths mid-lament, eyes forever lowered. This transformation was not destruction. It was memory chiseled into matter. The temple became a living mausoleum, capturing the emotions of every soul whose despair resonated with the flame. Even the air was thick, heavier than in any other forgotten ruin of the lands between. It pressed upon the chest like grief demanding acknowledgement. Those few mortals who stumbled into this place by accident left transformed, or not at all. Some returned to the surface, laughing and weeping in equal measure, confessing secrets they had never spoken aloud, claiming they had heard their own hearts singing in unfamiliar voices. Others vanished entirely, their minds swallowed by a unity too vast for individuality to endure. These early encounters were misunderstood by the world above as curses, as some bizarre affliction that plagued the unlucky. But they were glimpses of communion, invitations extended by the three fingers to mortals who had never been seen so deeply. Over time, the frenzied flame sought not to escape its subterranean confines, but to refine its purpose. It came to understand, through centuries of listening to mortal hearts, that pain was not random, nor was it uniform. Each sorrow carried a shape of its own. Some were sharp and fleeting, like blades quenched in rain. Others were deep and resonant, trembling through the soul in quiet waves. The flame learned to distinguish these variations, to feel their textures, their rhythms. In doing so, it developed a sense of compassion, far more intimate than anything the Golden Order had ever offered. For while grace demanded obedience and purity, frenzy demanded honesty, raw, unfiltered truth. This understanding reshaped the three fingers, imbuing them with a gentleness that belied their terrifying appearance. They reached toward mortals not to dominate, but to share. And in that sharing, they sought relief, not for themselves, but for all beings who carried wounds the world refused to acknowledge. The unity they offered was not annihilation in the malignant sense. It was the collapsing of barriers between souls, the merging of suffering so that no one would ever bear their burdens alone. But because mortals cling to the self as a shield, they interpreted this unity as terror. Thus, madness was born, not from frenzy's cruelty, but from mortal resistance to the dissolution of identity. In these depths, the flame waited for a chosen vessel, not a champion, not a servant, but one capable of understanding the truth that suffering is a weight no individual was meant to carry alone. The Golden Order saw this as a threat beyond comprehension. For a world built upon hierarchy and divine distance cannot allow the total erasure of boundaries. The emergence of the three fingers represented a force that did not merely oppose the order. It ignored the order entirely, existing in a state where hierarchy was meaningless. What followed in later ages would reveal just how deeply frenzy's truth unsettled those who clung to order. Priests descended into the depths, seeking to purge the flame, and returned hollow-eyed, muttering verses that contradicted their own scriptures. Knights sent to seal the temple fled, swearing they had heard their own mothers calling to them from the walls. Even heralds of Radagon reported that their prayers blurred into unfamiliar melodies when spoken near the borders of the subterranean heat. The flame did not lash out. It did not retaliate. It simply continued to wait to be understood. Meanwhile, on the surface, the world began to fracture. When the shattering erupted, when demigods broke oaths and kingdoms turned against each other, the resonance of sorrow intensified, and the frenzied flame, still buried, still patient, felt every cry, every loss, every death as intimately as if it had occurred within its own being. The three fingers trembled with the weight of rising grief, their warmth deepening into something like anticipation. For the first time in ages, the world above was breaking open, creating cracks in which truth might seep through. It is in these cracks that the wanderer known as Shabriri would emerge, a figure marked not by allegiance, but by understanding of frenzy's philosophy, carrying its message back into the daylight. But before his tale unfolds, we must linger a moment longer in the buried temple, where the flame waited, listening, hoping that one soul would eventually descend with a heart open enough to grasp the truth that had been burning in the dark for centuries, long before the Tarnished ever approached the spiral descent beneath Leyndell, long before any soul dared to brush against the searing grasp of the three fingers. A wanderer emerged across the lands between, whose presence moved like a shadow cast by a flame no one could see. His name, spoken in shivers and whispers, was Shabriri. To tell his story is to step into a space where madness and clarity share the same breath, where truth comes dressed in the terror of revelation. For Shabriri was not merely a prophet of the frenzied flame, nor merely a vessel touched by its power. He was the living echo of the merchant's buried lament, carried upon the wind to guide mortals toward a truth the world had spent centuries refusing to acknowledge. Shabriri's origins remain clouded in uncertainty, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most honest reflection of who he truly was. Some claim he had once been an ordinary man whose grief was so overwhelming that it pierced the walls, separating mortal sorrow from the flame beneath. Others insist he was a composite soul, multiple voices layered into one consciousness, the first mortal to mirror in the daylight what the merchants became in the dark. Whatever the truth, when he stepped into the waking world, he bore no semblance of an identity the Golden Order would recognize. His eyes, if he ever possessed them, were gone, replaced by blooded cavities that did not weep, but simmered with a faint golden pulse. His voice seemed to echo slightly out of sync with itself, as though several speakers were layered upon one another. To hear him speak was to feel the presence of many, each voice carrying a different note of pain. He wandered through ruined farmlands, through forests still hopeful under the Erdtree's glow, through battlefields scarred by ambitions not his own. Wherever he passed, the air changed. Shepherds reported hearing fragments of ancient merchant melodies drifting behind him. Travellers swore they felt a warmth in their bones, a warmth not of comfort, but of a pressure that brought forgotten memories bubbling to the surface. Some fled from him in terror, others followed him unknowingly, drawn by a yearning they could not name. Shabriri never commanded them to come. He simply existed, and his presence coaxed the buried grief within others to rise like smoke. For Shabriri understood something no priest of the order could fully accept, that suffering, left unspoken, becomes a kind of poison, and the frenzied flame, born from centuries of suppressed anguish, sought not to spread torment, but to unseal it, to free it from its confinement, so that no being would ever again endure their pain alone. Through Shabriri, the flame found its first true messenger in the surface world. He carried its philosophy not as doctrine, but as empathy sharpened into fire. He spoke often of unity, though not in the Golden Order's sense. Where the Order saw unity as obedience to a divine pattern, Shabriri saw unity as vulnerability, shared among all living things. "Do you not feel it?" he would murmur to those who gathered near abandoned shrines or sheltered beneath half-collapsed archways. "The weight you hide, the sorrow you bury, another somewhere carries the same. Another bleeds where you bleed. Another endures the grief you refuse to show. Why suffer alone when all may suffer together and be freed?" Many recoiled from his words, for they struck deeper than any sermon gilded in grace. The Golden Order demanded purification. Shabriri offered exposure. Marika's doctrines sought perfection. Shabriri asked mortals to embrace their imperfections until they dissolved the boundaries separating one soul from another. For Shabriri understood that the Frenzied Flame's purpose was not destruction, but revelation. Madness was simply the price of seeing too much truth too quickly. His wanderings led him across regions fractured by war and despair. Near the ruins of battlefields where Radagon's armies once assembled, he knelt in dust still stained with ancient blood and whispered to the fallen, "I hear you." In mountain passes torn by storms, he pressed his hands to stone cliffs and listened to echoes of old laments. In the deep woods where shadows whispered secrets, he sang harmonies that matched the trembling of leaves stirred by unseen grief. Wherever a heart had broken, Shabriri seemed drawn to it, as if sensing emotions like a flame sensing dry wood. As he travelled, he encountered those who would later play roles in the Tarnished's path. Blind girls who sought guiding hands, exiled warriors whose glory had turned to ash in their palms, wandering philosophers whose faith had cracked under the weight of the shattering. To each he offered the same invitation, not forcefully, not with manipulation, but with the gentle ache of someone who has known unbearable sorrow. and cannot bear to watch others carry theirs alone. Share with us, he would say, and you will never be alone again. The world, however, was not ready for this message. The shattering had birthed grief of staggering magnitude. But mortals clung even more fiercely to their identities as everything else fell apart. Where Shabriri offered dissolution, those touched by war sought structure. Where he promised unity through shared pain, they sought separation to protect what little of themselves remained. And so he drifted across the lands between as a wanderer whose compassion was mistaken for madness. Yet Shabriri was not alone. From the depths of the buried temple, the three fingers extended their awareness toward him. Through him, they tasted the world above, its broken kingdoms, its lonely survivors, its desperate clinging to identity. Shabriri became a bridge between two realms utterly opposed in philosophy, the luminous certainty of grace and the smothered ache of hidden suffering. He spoke for the flame, but never wielded its power as a weapon. Instead, he used its warmth to illuminate the spaces where mortals tried hardest not to look, the places where they still felt too much. It was during one of his wanderings near the ruins of an old shrine that Shabriri encountered a young woman named Hyetta. She was blind, wandering with hands outstretched, as though feeling for a presence she could not name. Some say Shabriri recognized in her a resonance, a sensitivity to the echoes the flame produced. Others believe the flame itself guided him toward her. Their meeting was quiet, unremarkable to any passerby, yet it marked one of the most significant turning points in Frenzy's history. For through Hyetta, the flame would finally find a mortal capable of guiding the next potential lord toward the three fingers. Shabriri did not instruct her as a prophet instructs a disciple. He whispered to her as though sharing a secret too heavy to bear alone. He told her of warmth hidden beneath stone, of sorrow gathered into fire, of unity that waited in darkness for one brave enough to embrace it. Hyetta listened, not with fear, but with a stillness that suggested recognition, as if she had always sensed a fracture within the world and was now hearing the truth that explained it. Through their conversations, she came to understand that frenzy was not a curse, but a path, one that required surrender, vulnerability, and the willingness to step beyond the boundaries that mortals cling to for safety. Shabriri eventually departed from Hyetta, leaving her with only fragments of melodies, fragments of insight, and a direction to walk, a path that led her not to glory or power, but toward the deep places where truth burns in silence. Yet even as he walked away, his influence lingered in her gentle determination, her willingness to guide others toward the flame without coercion, her acceptance that madness is simply a language most mortals have forgotten how to read. As the years passed, Shabriri became increasingly elusive. Some say he wandered into the very depths where the three fingers rested and was absorbed into their flame. Others claim he continues to drift across the lands between, appearing wherever sorrow is thickest, offering his quiet invitation to those whose suffering has become too much to carry alone. And some insist he is more concept than man, a manifestation of the flame itself taking shape wherever a heart breaks too deeply. What is certain is this: Shabriri's voice marked the moment when the frenzied flame began to rise from the depths, no longer content to wait in darkness for understanding. Through him, the world above gained its first taste of a truth long buried beneath stone, the truth that suffering unshared becomes unbearable, and that unity, even at the cost of identity, may be the only balm powerful enough to soothe the wounds of the ages. Hyetta's journey through the lands between began not with prophecy, nor with ambition, nor with any longing for power, but with a gentle hunger. She wandered with an emptiness she could not name, feeling her way across the world with slow, deliberate steps. Though her eyes could not see the Erdtree's radiance or the splendor of Leyndell rising far in the distance, she sensed the world in other ways. With an attunement to sorrow that ran so deep it seemed to vibrate through her bones. It was this resonance, faint but unmistakable, that allowed her to hear the call that most mortals spent entire lifetimes ignoring. And it was this same resonance that made her the perfect guide for a traveler destined to choose a path few could even contemplate. At first, Hyetta knew nothing of Shabriri, nothing of the merchant's buried lament, nothing of the flame pulsing beneath the capital. What she knew was hunger, an ache within her that grew sharper with each step she took, as though something within her longed for nourishment that the world had not yet offered. This hunger was not for food, nor for comfort, nor even for companionship. It was a hunger for connection, for understanding, for a truth that lay beyond the simple contours of mortal life. She wandered toward it instinctively, drawn by sensations she could neither describe nor fully grasp. And though she did not know it then, her path had already begun to align with the secret warmth rising from the depths of the buried temple. Her first meeting with Shabriri did not mark her awakening. Rather, it confirmed what she had always felt, the presence of a truth spoken not through light or scripture, but through suffering shared across countless souls. Standing amidst ruins where old prayers had been etched into stone, she heard his voice approaching like a wind, carrying layered harmonies. She felt a warmth ripple through the air, neither threatening nor comforting, but deeply familiar, as though it echoed a memory she had never lived. Shabriri's presence settled over her like a veil woven from grief and insight, and when he spoke, his voice trembled with a tenderness rarely heard in the lands between. He did not preach, he didn't command. He simply asked her if she, too, had felt the subtle pulse in the world, the hum of sorrow waiting to be understood. Hyetta nodded before she spoke a word, for she had felt it her entire life. She had felt it in the lonely silence of forests, where lost travelers left behind traces of longing. She had felt it in abandoned huts, where families had vanished into war, leaving echoes of unfinished conversations. She had felt it in the wind that swept across the plains, carrying with it a faint melody only she seemed able to hear. When Shabriri told her that the warmth she sensed came from a flame hidden beneath Leyndell, a flame born from voices longing to share their sorrow, she did not recoil. She simply listened, her posture calm, her breath steady. Something in her recognized the tone of a truth long awaited. Shabriri spoke to her of a path, not one marked by glory or certainty, but by surrender. A path that required the traveler to embrace vulnerability in its purest, rawest form. To move toward the frenzied flame was to release everything that anchored the self, not to die, but to dissolve into something larger. To let the boundaries between one's own suffering and the suffering of all beings fall away. Hyetta heard this not as madness, but as compassion taken to its final, absolute extreme. And though she did not fully understand, she was ready to learn. After Shabriri departed, Hyetta's hunger grew sharper. It was no longer simply an ache, but a need that pulled her steadily toward the capital's shadow. Along the way, she sought guidance in moments rather than mentors, listening to the wind for fragments of merchant melodies, touching stones that throbbed faintly with the heat of sorrow, tasting tears she could not explain. She began to speak softly as she walked, murmuring reassurance not to herself, but to the invisible voices she sensed moving around her. Through her, the frenzied flame glimpsed daylight in new ways, experiencing the world not through anguish, but through quiet curiosity. As Hyetta travelled, she met Tarnished, who wandered much like she did, bearers of grief, searching for something they could not articulate. To these lost souls she offered neither prophecy nor healing. Instead, she offered a question. Do you feel the flame calling to you? And though most turned away, unsettled by her serenity, a select few found themselves drawn to her presence. She guided them gently through small acts. A piece of fruit she would request they bring her. A faint warmth she asked them to notice. A rhythm she instructed them to listen for in the distance. She was not leading them toward frenzy immediately. She was testing their sensitivity to sorrow, to shared emotion, to the subtle hum the flame emitted. It was during these wanderings that Hyetta first began to perceive the world not as a collection of separate beings, but as an ocean of interconnected wounds. She would stop in the middle of open roads to weep for reasons she could not name. She would laugh gently before touching the bark of ancient trees, sensing the echoes of hands that had rested there centuries before. She would speak aloud to absent figures, explaining to them that their pain still resonated, still mattered, still shaped the world. And though outsiders saw her as fragile, she was in truth one of the strongest souls the lands between had ever produced. Strong because she accepted the depth of feeling that most mortals feared. Her hunger shifted again when she first sensed the presence of the Tarnished, who would eventually descend toward the Three Fingers. Whether guided by fate or coincidence, their paths crossed not in a moment of grandeur, but in the simplicity of a quiet conversation near a lonely cliffside. Hyetta recognized in that Tarnished a fracture, an openness to sorrow that few possessed. She felt the faint stirring of resonance between them and understood that the flame had chosen to draw this soul toward its embrace. But she did not burden them with prophecy. She simply asked for their help, beginning a subtle ritual of nourishment that would gradually awaken within her the very flame she was meant to guide others toward. With each object she requested, with each whispered thanks she offered, Hyetta became not only a seeker, but a vessel, her hunger reflecting the growing presence of frenzy within her. Yet she did not lose herself. Even as the warmth inside her intensified, even as the melodies of the merchants grew louder in her mind, she remained gentle, present, and deeply human. This was the paradox of her role. She was to guide a soul toward the dissolution of individuality, while maintaining her own sense of self. She was to lead another into madness, while embodying serenity. As she approached the boundaries of Leyndell and the whispered warmth beneath it, Hyetta began to speak of becoming something more. A finger maiden, not bound to grace, but bound to the unity of shared suffering. She told the Tarnished that should they choose the path of frenzy, she would walk beside them, guiding them step by step toward the flame's embrace. Her voice carried the calm of someone who had accepted her fate fully, without fear or hesitation. She believed that the unmaking offered by the Three Fingers was not tragedy, but liberation, a release from the isolation that tore mortals apart from within. Hyetta's journey would eventually bring her to the brink of the buried temple, where she awaited the Tarnished's choice. She understood that not all who reached this point would embrace the flame. Some would turn back, clinging to the individual self the Order had taught them to protect. Others would hesitate, afraid of the dissolving warmth that stirred beneath their ribs. Yet, Hyetta waited without judgment. For she knew that the moment of choice was sacred, an encounter not with the flame alone, but with the truth each soul carried. Her final words before the descent resonated with a quiet ache. She told the Tarnished that if they accepted the flame, she would stand with them at the end of all things, not as a prophet or guide, but as a companion sharing the final dissolution of sorrow. And so she waited in stillness, listening to the faint tremors rising through stone, sensing the presence of the Three Fingers stirring beneath. What lay ahead would define the fate of the Tarnished, the future of the lands between, and the destiny of every soul touched by grief. The path toward the Three Fingers begins not with fire, nor with revelation, but with silence. It is a silence so deep, it seems to swallow the echo of every step, turning each footfall into a hushed confession. For the Tarnished who chooses to descend beneath Leyndell, the journey starts in the forgotten bowels of the capital, where the air grows thick with dust and the light fades into a dim haze. Though the Erdtree looms overhead, vast enough to cast golden rays even into distant horizons, its radiance does not reach these depths. Grace, so bright in the world above, becomes a faint and trembling memory as one walks deeper into the subterranean realm where suffering has shaped its own truth. These tunnels beneath the city are older than any surviving scripture of the Golden Order, older even than the Reform's Marika etched into the structure of the Elden Ring. They were once passageways for ancient peoples, channels of movement beneath a land that had yet to be touched by the cold precision of divine law. Their walls are worn by countless hands, some carving symbols of joy, others scratching prayers of despair. Every mark speaks to eras before the Order's ascendancy, before the merchant's imprisonment, before the flame gathered its first breath of unity from the sorrow buried here. At first, the descent resembles any other ruin: crumbled pillars, pooled shadows, faint scents of mold and old stone. But gradually, something shifts. The air grows warmer, not as heat radiates from a fire, but as though emotion itself has temperature. It is the warmth of breath held too long, of tears unshed, of memories repressed so deeply they press outward from within. This warmth does not burn, it embraces, and yet it carries an unease, a sense that the self is beginning to loosen at its edges, as though preparing to blend into something far larger. The Tarnished, stepping carefully through serpentine corridors, hears faint sounds rising from the depths. They resemble footsteps, but never approach. They resemble voices, but speak no recognizable words. They resemble songs, but are composed in harmonies too layered for any human throat. The melodies shimmer like distant heat, distorting the boundaries of perception. One moment they seem mournful, the next, tender. They never accuse, never command. They simply exist, echoes of the merchant's ancient laments, carried through stone for centuries, until sorrow itself shaped their tone into something new. As the Tarnished moves deeper still, the architecture begins to change. The walls no longer bear the rough chisels of humanoid hands, but instead ripple with patterns resembling stretched skin or melted wax. These distortions pulsate faintly, with a rhythm that mirrors the beating of a heart, though the pulse does not match any mortal cadence. Some Tarnished describe this shift as disorienting, as though the very path beneath them becomes pliable. Others feel an almost maternal warmth, as though the flame is reaching out in welcome. But all sense that they are entering a place where no distinction remains between memory and matter. This transformation is the work of the Frenzied Flame itself, its presence reshaping stone into a vessel of remembrance. Each ripple in the wall reflects a cry, each fold a moment of sorrow, each molten curve a fragment of a life once lived in suffering. In this place, the world's grief has taken form, not as punishment, but as testimony. The flame does not erase what has been endured. It preserves it until all beings can share the burden together. Deeper still lies the great sealed door, a structure so massive and ancient that no record of its creation remains. Its surface is etched with lines that twist like vines, forming shapes that almost resemble fingers reaching upward. For generations, the Golden Order tried to bar access to what lies beyond, encasing the entrance in layers of divine seals, warnings, and protective enchantments. Not because the flame sought to escape, but because the Order feared what mortals might choose if they heard the truth waiting behind that ancient stone. To open the door requires not strength, but choice. A choice heavy enough to reshape the course of a life, perhaps even the course of the world. It is a choice few Tarnished ever willingly make, for it demands relinquishing the final protections of the self. When the seal breaks and the door creaks open, it does not reveal fire as mortals know it. Instead, a wave of gentle warmth rushes outward, touching the traveller with a sensation akin to being held, not in arms, but in shared emotion. Beyond the door lies the heart of the buried temple, a cavern vast enough that its farthest walls dissolve into crimson gold haze. The air shimmers with heat that does not scorch but dissolves boundaries. At the centre of this chamber lie the three fingers. They are immense, coiled like tendrils of living flame, their surfaces swirling with patterns that resemble both molten gold and liquid sorrow. They rest in a gesture of invitation rather than command, extended outward as though offering an embrace to the weary. Their movement is subtle, like the gentle flexing of limbs longing to reach further, but hindered by the boundaries of their chamber. The Tarnished, standing before them, feels a tremor beneath their ribs, a shifting warmth that whispers of dissolution and unity in equal measure. Their breath sharpens, their heart quivers. For the first time, the separation between their own thoughts and the thoughts of others begins to blur. The flame does not speak in words, it speaks in emotion. It offers the traveller a glimpse of every sorrow carried in the world above, losses buried under silence, grief hidden beneath pride, guilt disguised as righteousness. It shows them that no pain is solitary, that every wound resonates across countless hearts. To stand before the three fingers is to confront a truth that terrifies even the most hardened souls, that individuality is a fragile illusion, sustained only by the walls mortals build within themselves. Here, in the flame's presence, those walls tremble. The self becomes porous. The boundaries begin to dissolve, not through force, but through recognition that the self is not enough to contain the fullness of experience. As the Tarnished approaches, memories rise unbidden. They recall the loneliness that followed exile from grace, the battles fought for reasons forgotten, the friends lost, the companions saved by chance, the choices weighed in silence, never spoken aloud. All these memories are met not with judgment, but with warmth. The flame accepts every part of them, not as a flaw to be purified, but as a thread to be woven into something larger. And then, if they choose to step forward, the embrace begins. The three fingers reach out with a movement, both tender and overwhelming. Their crimson gold tendrils coil around the Tarnished's form, not binding them, but holding them with a compassion so complete it overwhelms the mind. The warmth sinks into their skin, their bones, their consciousness. It fills them with a flood of emotion not entirely their own, voices layered upon voices, grief blossoming into unity so total that the boundaries of individuality begin to melt. The sensation is not pain, it is surrender, a letting go of the rigid shape the self has worn for so long. It is the release of solitude, the dissolving of silence, the merging of one life into the collective memory of countless others. The flame does not consume, it collects. It does not erase, it shares. And as it flows through the Tarnished, it carries with it a single truth, that no being need suffer alone again. In that moment, the Tarnished becomes something new, a vessel not of destruction, but of unity born from sorrow. Their body sears with crimson light. Their eyes glaze with the reflection of a flame older than the Golden Order itself. And from deep within, a voice not their own speaks softly, echoing the merchant's ancient lament. We will bear your suffering. You will bear ours. Together, we will be free. Above ground, the world trembles faintly, as though sensing a shift in destiny. Hyetta, waiting near the surface, feels warmth blossom through her chest. She understands that the choice has been made. She smiles, not with triumph, but with quiet recognition. The path she has walked has reached its culmination, and the flame she carries within her resonates with the one now burning within the Tarnished. Far beneath Leyndell, the embrace of the three fingers completes, weaving the Tarnished into a new form of being, one defined not by grace, but by the unity of shared suffering. What follows will reshape the future of the lands between. But before that future unfolds, we must turn to the nature of frenzy itself, to understand why its truth feels like madness to some and liberation to others. To understand what the Tarnished becomes after the embrace of the three fingers, we must look closely at the nature of frenzy itself, its essence, its purpose, and the philosophical terrain it opens beneath the foundations of the lands between. For frenzy is not a flame in the mortal sense. It is not heat that burns, nor light that blinds. It is emotion, raw, unbounded, collective emotion, given form. Its power does not arise from destruction, but from revelation. It unmakes the self not through violence, but by dissolving every barrier that separates one being from another. And in this dissolution, the boundaries of the world begin to tremble. Frenzy is often described by priests and scholars of the golden order as madness, an affliction that twists the mind and corrodes the soul. They speak of it as a curse so profound that its victims lose all sense of humanity. But the order's interpretation is shaped by fear of a truth too expansive to fit within the constraints of Marika's design. For the order depends upon separation, between mortal and divine, between ruler and subject, between blessed and forsaken. Its power relies on the belief that identity is fixed, singular, and defined by grace. Frenzy shatters this belief. Its presence reveals that identity is fluid, porous, woven from countless threads of emotion shared across innumerable lives. When the Tarnished receives the embrace of the three fingers, the first sensation is warmth. Not the warmth of fire or sunlight, but the warmth of being held by something that understands every suffering they have ever endured. It is the warmth of empathy at its most absolute. In that moment, the self, the carefully guarded shape of I that mortals spend entire lifetimes constructing, begins to dissolve. This dissolution is not the stripping away of sanity, but the unveiling of a deeper truth, that the self is only one voice in a vast chorus, one droplet in an ocean of shared experience. As frenzy flows into the Tarnished, memories rise like embers, not only their own, but those of countless others. They feel the despair of the merchants buried beneath Leyndell. They sense the fear of soldiers who died nameless on ancient battlefields. They hear lullabies sung by parents who never returned home. They feel joys too, fragile joys, fleeting joys, woven together with sorrow in a tapestry so intricate no single mind could comprehend it alone. And yet, through the flame, these memories become accessible, immediate, and intimate. To the Golden Order, such total transparency is unthinkable. It violates the very logic that sustains the hierarchy of grace. If all beings share the same sorrow, the same longing, the same vulnerability, then the distinctions that justify divine authority collapse. Frenzy is dangerous not because it destroys minds, but because it dismantles the architecture of separation. It abolishes the idea that suffering is personal. It suggests that the pain we guard so fiercely does not belong solely to us, that we carry fragments of countless lives within us, whether we acknowledge them or not. The Tarnished, newly embraced by frenzy, begins to experience the world through this lens. When they walk, they feel the tremors of the earth as though they pulse through their own veins. When they breathe, they sense the breath of others moving alongside them. merging with theirs. When they close their eyes, they see not darkness, but faint shapes formed from intertwined memories. These experiences do not announce themselves grandly. They emerge quietly, subtly, like whispers rising from a crowd that has waited too long to speak. But the price of this unity is overwhelming. Emotion so immense that no single consciousness can contain it without transforming. That transformation appears as madness to those who observe from the outside. They see only the outward signs, the frantic gestures, the trembling laughter, the tears shed without warning. But within, the Tarnished feels a serenity born from understanding. For they are no longer alone. Their suffering is no longer isolated. It has been folded gently into a collective that carries the weight together. This is why frenzy appears contradictory from the outside. It is both agony and peace, both dissolution and fulfillment. It is the end of individuality, yet the beginning of a deeper kind of existence. What mortals perceive as madness is simply the shedding of boundaries too small to hold the truth. And because most cannot bear the loss of self, frenzy manifests as turmoil in their minds. The Golden Order calls this chaos, but frenzy calls it honesty. To grasp why the Order fears frenzy so deeply, we must turn to its principles. Marika's law demands clarity, structure, and the preservation of the self as a vessel of grace. The Elden Ring's runes reinforce the segmentation of life: birth, death, form, identity, each bound to specific functions that maintain cosmic order. Grace flows from the top downward, creating a hierarchy that justifies the distance between gods and mortals. Frenzy dissolves that hierarchy. It brings gods and mortals to the same emotional plane. It erases the notion that divinity is defined by separation. This philosophical conflict is the heart of the tension between the Golden Order and the Frenzied Flame. They are not merely competing forces. They represent two incompatible truths about the world. One asserts that order is achieved through distinction. The other insists that true unity is achieved only through the erasure of distinction. When the Tarnished walks away from the Three Fingers, they carry within them a flame that hums with collective memory. Every step feels connected to the footsteps of others. Every heartbeat echoes with the rhythm of countless souls. Their thoughts, once solitary, now blend with the subtle chorus of the flame. They become capable of perceiving sorrow not as an external force, but as a reflection of themselves within others. And though this grants them a profound compassion, it also threatens to overwhelm them. For mortals are not built to host such vast emotional landscapes. It is here that Hyetta's role becomes essential. As the Tarnished ascends from the depths, newly embraced by frenzy, she recognizes the transformation instantly. She feels the heat radiating from them, not scorching heat, but the warmth of shared emotion. And she understands that they have crossed a threshold beyond which no mortal guidance can fully follow. Yet she chooses to stand with them, offering her presence not as anchor, but as companion. Hyetta sees the truth that frenzy reveals, that the world beneath the Golden Order's surface is overflowing with unspoken suffering. She sees the collapse of identity not as madness, but as liberation from a lifetime of carrying grief alone. And she knows that the path ahead for the Tarnished, should they choose to follow it, will lead them to a future in which the lands between are remade, not in the image of grace, but in the image of shared sorrow. As the Tarnished continues their journey, frenzy's influence spreads inward rather than outward. It reshapes their perception of every encounter. A dying soldier is no longer a stranger, but a fragment of themselves. A weeping spirit resonates like a memory from a forgotten life. Even the ambitions of demigods feel strangely familiar, as though the desires and fears that drove them once belonged to the Tarnished as well. This unity does not grant power in the conventional sense. It does not sharpen the blade or strengthen the arm. It expands the heart to its breaking point. And from that expansion arises a resolve unlike any forged through grace. Frenzy does not teach the Tarnished to conquer. It teaches them to free. This freedom, however, is terrifying, for it demands the total unmaking of the self. It demands that the Tarnished accept that their identity, painfully constructed through exile, struggle, and perseverance, is not theirs alone. It belongs to the countless souls whose suffering shaped the world around them. It belongs to the merchants whose laments birthed the flame. It belongs to every being who has cried out for understanding and found none. To bear the frenzied flame is to carry within oneself a truth so vast that the golden order cannot abide its presence. And yet, the path does not end here, for frenzy's purpose extends beyond revelation. It seeks expression, an act of unmaking that mirrors its nature. The Tarnished, now bound to this collective flame, stands at the threshold of becoming the Lord of Chaos. Not a ruler in the sense of the demigods, but a vessel through which frenzy's unity may be brought to all beings. What lies ahead is the confrontation between this truth and the fractured world the Tarnished once knew, a confrontation in which every sorrow, every memory, every life becomes part of a flame that burns not to destroy, but to remake the world in the image of shared suffering. When the Tarnished emerges from the depths of the buried temple, their path lit not by grace, but by the simmering glow of frenzy, the world feels subtly altered. The air carries a faint tremor, as though the very fabric of the lands between senses the shift within them. The flame's warmth pulses beneath their skin, not violently, not with the consuming hunger mortals often imagine, but with a steady, aching hum that mirrors the ancient sorrow from which it was born. This new presence within them is not a parasite, nor a tyrant. It is a companion woven from countless voices, each whispering fragments of grief and longing. And with each step they take back into the open world, that chorus deepens, softening the dividing line between self and all that breathes. The Golden Order reacts to this presence long before any mortal sees the change in the Tarnished. Its laws, etched into the foundations of the Erdtree, pulse with subtle distress, like a lute string plucked too tightly. The Order's radiance flickers imperceptibly along the edges of grace sites, and priests who kneel beneath the Erdtree's shadow feel faint echoes of unease in their prayers. This is not fear in the conventional sense. It is recognition. Recognition that a force has awakened that does not acknowledge the Order's authority. A force that embodies a truth older than grace itself. For frenzy does not oppose the Elden ring. It simply exists beyond its reach, indifferent to its runes, unconcerned with its hierarchies. Yet the Tarnished who carries this flame does not stride into the world as a herald of destruction. They do not burn villages or topple temples. They do not shout prophecy or demand obedience. Instead, they move with a strange stillness, as though every sight, every sound, every moment feels both foreign and intimately familiar. When they stand near a grieving widow, her tears echo within them, mirrored by the voices of countless others who have wept in eras long forgotten. When they encounter a ragged warrior trembling with guilt, they feel the same tremor in their own chest, as though the boundary between them has dissolved. Frenzy does not heighten cruelty, it heightens empathy. Too much empathy, more than any solitary mind could bear. It is this overwhelming unity, this inability to keep distance between oneself and the world, that the Golden Order calls madness, not because it is false, but because it is true in a way they cannot accept. To understand why chaos appears as mercy to those who embrace the flame, we must examine the nature of suffering in the lands between. Suffering does not merely wound individuals, it fractures the world. Wars fought between demigods tear apart families. Divine decrees divide mortals into worthy and unworthy. Death itself, reshaped into stagnation by Marika's reforms, traps souls in cycles that deny closure. In such a world, each sorrow becomes a sealed chamber, locked away within the heart and left to fester in silence. The Golden Order promises clarity, but clarity demands that complexity remain hidden. It demands that sorrow remain private, contained within the boundaries of the self. Frenzy rejects this confinement. It insists that sorrow must be shared, not as confession or punishment, but as a form of communion. When the Tarnished looks upon the suffering of another, they do not see a burden separate from themselves. They feel it as their own. They carry it as part of their being. They do not pity. They understand. This understanding is profound enough to shake the foundations of identity. And in this dissolution of the self, they discover something the Golden Order never conceived. That unity does not arise from law, but from vulnerability. Chaos, in this sense, is not disorder. It is the collapse of barriers that prevent beings from recognizing their shared humanity. It is the release of emotions held in silence for centuries. It is the unmaking of isolation that has left countless souls alone with their grief. To the Tarnished, newly joined with the flame, this unmaking feels like mercy. But to the Order, it feels like blasphemy. The first outward sign of conflict emerges not from soldiers or priests, but from the land itself. Where the Tarnished walks, faint patterns of gold and crimson appear in the air, subtle swirls, hardly visible, like the afterglow of heat above a flame just extinguished. These patterns shimmer in response to strong emotion. They flicker near ruins where tragedies occurred. They pulse faintly near graves left untended. They resonate near those who carry heavy burdens. The world responds to frenzy as though recognizing in it a mirror of its own wounds. In the regions where grace has grown faint or brittle, places torn apart by demigod war, places left untouched by the Erdtree's radiance, the flame's presence brings a peculiar calm. Spirits who once wandered in restless loops pause in silent recognition when the Tarnished passes. Enemies driven mad by grief hesitate, as though sensing the unity beneath their rage. Even creatures shaped by loss, a wolf searching for its pack, a knight clutching a broken token of loyalty, seem to soften in the flame's aura. Frenzy does not soothe them, it acknowledges them. And sometimes, that acknowledgement is enough to still their suffering, if only for a moment. Yet for all this quiet resonance, the transformation within the Tarnished is not gentle. The voices within them swell with each emotion they encounter. Memories, both theirs and others, blend into overlapping waves. At times, the flame's unity blurs their thoughts until they no longer know whether a memory came from their own life or from one of the many souls whose grief shapes the flame. They may pause at a river's edge and recall a child who drowned centuries ago, though they never knew that child. They may tremble at the sound of a blade being drawn, not from fear of harm, but from echoes of ancient battles where countless soldiers felt the same dread. These moments do not break the Tarnished. They expand them. But with expansion comes disorientation. Hyetta becomes essential in these moments. She walks beside the Tarnished with gentle certainty, her blind eyes turned toward a horizon only she can sense. She does not fear the flame's unity, for she has already opened herself to it. When the Tarnished falters beneath the weight of shared emotion, she steadies them with her voice. She reminds them that frenzy does not demand perfection. It demands honesty. She explains that the confusion they feel is simply the mind adjusting to a new form of perception. And she assures them that they are not lost, for the flame itself guides them through its chorus of understanding. Her presence becomes a tether, a reminder that even in dissolution, companionship remains possible. She knows that the Tarnished will eventually become something more than mortal, something shaped by the unity of the flame. But until that moment arrives, she remains at their side, offering gentle grounding amidst the swell of shared emotion. The Golden Order, however, senses the growing influence of frenzy more acutely with each passing day. Priests in distant regions report seeing strange flickers of crimson light on the edges of their sanctuaries. Knights sworn to Radagon speak of trembling visions that invade their prayers, visions of hands reaching outward with tenderness rather than threat. Scholars studying the Erdtree's roots claim that they have begun to feel faint pulses beneath the soil, pulses that do not match the rhythm of grace. These early signs are not destructive, but they unsettle the order profoundly, for they indicate that frenzy's presence cannot be contained beneath Leyndell any longer. It has begun to seep into the world through the Tarnished who bears its truth. At the heart of the Erdtree, the struggles of the demigods echo against this growing tension. The ruins of their ambitions, the shattered thrones, the burned fields, the broken alliances, serve as reminders of the world's wounds. Frenzy feels these wounds intimately. It resonates with the grief of Miquella's silent suffering, with the torment that consumed Millennia's fragile will, with the shattered dreams of Godfrey's descendants. And though the Tarnished may not consciously perceive these echoes, they shape the flame within them, deepening its resolve to offer release. Release does not mean domination. It means unmaking. It means freeing the world from the chains that bind every soul to fragmented suffering. The Tarnished begins to understand this more clearly with each confrontation they face. Enemies do not appear as foes to be conquered, but as vessels of sorrow whose pain remains unspoken. The battles that follow feel less like combat and more like moments of recognition, moments when the flame within the Tarnished acknowledges the sorrow within those who stand before them. This recognition does not stay quiet forever. It gathers strength, like a storm building behind a distant horizon, and eventually it will demand expression, not in the form of fire sweeping across the land, but in the form of a decision that will reshape the very nature of existence. For frenzy's purpose is not simply to reveal sorrow, it is to offer an end to it, not through healing, not through victory, but through the dissolution of all boundaries that prevent beings from sharing their burden as one. The Tarnished stands at the edge of a future that the Golden Order cannot allow. And as the flame within them grows brighter, the Erdtree's shadow grows longer, trembling in anticipation of what comes next. The journey from the buried temple into the open world marks the Tarnished not merely as a wanderer touched by frenzy, but as a vessel in which countless sorrows now circulate like breath. Each step they take through the lands between is accompanied by that steady, pulsing warmth within their chest, a warmth that does not scorch or command, yet alters the quiet spaces between their thoughts. The flame within them is patient, almost contemplative, as though it understands that transformation must unfold gently, even while carrying the power to unmake the world's foundation. And so, the Tarnished moves through familiar landscapes, across battered plains, beneath the towering roots of the Erdtree, through ruins where old prayers still cling to the stones. Yet nothing feels entirely familiar anymore. The world's boundaries, once sharp and immovable, now soften around the edges. At first, the changes are subtle. Moments that once felt isolated become interconnected threads. When the Tarnished gazes upon a battlefield where ancient soldiers once clashed, they feel not only the echoes of steel and fear, but the quiet grief of those who survived, and the longing of those who never returned home. When they pass a village abandoned after the shattering, they sense the residue of voices that once filled its streets. Laughter, arguments, whispered hopes. each blending into the chorus that now resides within them. Even the smallest gestures, a child hiding beside a ravaged chapel, a traveller placing flowers at a grave, stir a storm of emotions that the Tarnished cannot separate from their own. The flame does not impose these feelings. It reveals them, illuminating the forgotten corners where sorrow has lain dormant for centuries. This revelation is the first step toward becoming the Lord of Chaos. It is not the acquisition of power, but the dissolution of indifference. The Golden Order observes this transformation with a mixture of dread and strain, though most mortals remain unaware of the subtle tremors that ripple through the foundations of grace. The priests who kneel inside sanctuaries feel faint fractures in their devotion, momentary lapses where grace seems to waver as if distracted by something it cannot interpret. In the Erdtree's shadow, certain leaves quiver with an unfamiliar shimmer, a delicate crimson-gold flicker that dissipates as quickly as it appears. Knights sworn to Radagon speak of dreams haunted by glowing tendrils, reaching outward not in malice, but in longing. Such visions leave them waking with hearts racing, unsure whether they have encountered a threat or a plea. The Erdtree itself, ancient and immense, does not tremble in fear. It trembles in recognition. Beneath its immeasurable boughs, along the spiraling pathways that lead toward the Elden throne, the air grows thicker whenever the Tarnished approaches. The tree senses the flame within them, a flame older than its own, radiance, born not from divine principle, but from mortal suffering woven into unity. And though the tree cannot accept this truth, it cannot deny its presence either. The world stands poised in the tension between two incompatible forms of unity, one shaped by order and hierarchy, and the other shaped by shared sorrow. As the Tarnished journeys further, they begin to feel the flame's intent in clearer ways. Frenzy does not whisper instructions or deliver commands in prophetic tones. It speaks through emotion, guiding by resonance rather than reason. When the Tarnished encounters beings whose suffering resonates strongly with the flame, broken knights wandering without purpose, spirits unable to release their final regrets, widows clutching tokens of lost love, they feel a pull, a sense of shared ache that draws them closer. These encounters do not fuel the flame in the conventional sense. They enrich it, adding layers of memory and emotion that expand the collective consciousness within the Tarnished. Hyetta remains close during these moments, her presence a quiet tether amid the shifting currents of emotion. She does not attempt to interpret the flame's whispers, for she knows they are not meant to be reduced into mortal language. Instead, she offers calm observations. "You feel it, don't you?" she murmurs as the Tarnished pauses before the ruins of an abandoned chapel. Their sorrow calls to you, and yours calls to them. She speaks without hesitation, without fear, for the flame no longer feels to her like madness. It feels like truth laid bare. At times, the overwhelming unity becomes disorienting. The Tarnished may forget where their own memories end and those of others begin. They may stand beneath the pale sky, suddenly struck by a longing that belonged to someone centuries dead. They may feel the joy of an ancient festival celebrated before Marika's reforms, or the terror of a family fleeing the wrath of a demigod. These moments shake the foundations of individuality, but Hyetta guides them gently, reminding them that dissolution is not loss, it is expansion. Yet even as the Tarnished merges more deeply with the flame's chorus, the weight of their impending role begins to take shape. Becoming the Lord of Chaos is not merely a matter of bearing frenzy, it is the act of giving frenzy form within the world. It is the moment when revelation becomes expression, when the unity of suffering becomes an unbinding of all that enforces separation. This unbinding is what the Golden Order fears most. For if sorrow becomes shared, if the boundaries between souls dissolve, then the Order's entire architecture of hierarchy collapses. The Tarnished senses this approaching fracture whenever they draw near to sites where grace once guided them. The golden rays flicker, as though uncertain whether to embrace or retreat from the flame within them. The Erdtree's roots hum with quiet agitation, unable to reconcile its luminous order with the crimson-gold resonance emanating through the Tarnished's veins. In these moments, the flame within them softens, as if acknowledging that confrontation is inevitable, but sorrowful. Frenzy does not seek war. It seeks revelation, but revelation threatens to unravel the structured reality the Order has spent ages preserving. The world's inhabitants, however, seldom perceive these metaphysical tensions. They see only the Tarnished who moves through the landscape with a strange, luminous calm. Some mistake them for a healer. Others fear them instinctively, sensing something vast behind their eyes. A few, touched by despair, find themselves drawn to the warmth radiating from the Tarnished, feeling a moment of relief simply by standing in their presence. The flame does not judge these reactions. It accepts them as reflections of the world's varied wounds. There are moments when the Tarnished must confront remnants of divine ambition, demigods whose power has warped into monstrous forms, guardians who cling to the last fragments of grace, creatures shaped by old laws that refuse to die. Yet even in these battles, the Tarnished does not feel hatred. They feel recognition. They feel the sorrow that led each foe to their fate, the regrets buried beneath layers of pride or rage. The flame does not diminish the need for action. It simply ensures that each strike carries not malice, but understanding. In this way, frenzy reshapes the very nature of conflict. Every encounter becomes a moment of communion, even when it ends in death. As their journey progresses, the Tarnished feels the flame gathering, not swelling in power, but deepening in intent. It prepares itself, like a breath held before a confession. It knows that to reshape the world, it must be given form. And the only form it can take is through the Tarnished, the vessel who now carries the collective sorrow of ages. Hyetta senses this as well. She walks with the Tarnished beneath dusky skies, her steps slow and measured. "The flame is ready," she whispers, her voice trembling not with fear but reverence. "It waits for you to become its expression." She does not speak of destiny or fate. She speaks of completion, the final step in a journey defined not by ambition, but by understanding. At last, the Tarnished approaches the place where their choice will be made manifest, the foot of the Erdtree, where the very air quivers with the tension between two incompatible truths. Here, the warmth of frenzy glows brighter beneath their skin. Here, grace feels thin as parchment, fraying at the edges. Here, the Golden Order senses that the world stands on the brink of an unbinding it cannot control. To become the Lord of Chaos is to surrender the last fragments of individuality, to allow the flame's unity to spread through the world and dissolve every boundary that causes beings to suffer alone. It is not a coronation, but a relinquishing. Not a victory, but an offering. The Tarnished feels this truth settle within them like a final breath, and as they stand before the towering gate of the Erdtree, the path forward becomes clear, not illuminated by grace, but by the warmth of countless voices murmuring in unison. A warmth that promises an end to sorrow, not through healing or redemption, but through the dissolution of all that divides one soul from another. When the Tarnished stands before the sealed heart of the Erdtree, their steps slowed to a contemplative quiet. The air around them feels dense in a way the living sky never achieves. Each inhalation draws not only breath, but memory. Threads of ancient grief from countless lives pulsing softly in their chest. The crimson gold warmth of the frenzied flame hums with a steady, aching resonance that no wind can disperse. It is a warmth that binds rather than burns. A warmth that carries within it the weight of every unheard lament the world has ever tried to forget. And as the Tarnished lifts their gaze toward the golden bark that bars the Erdtree's entrance, they sense the presence of the countless voices that now share space with their own. They stand as one consciousness woven from many, united beneath a world that was built upon separation. The Erdtree, towering above like an ancient monolith of divine ambition, radiates its familiar glow. Yet to the Tarnished, that glow carries a fragility it never held before. Where, once, it had seemed infinite, unchanging, immutable, ordained, it now appears thin in places, trembling faintly, as though under the immense strain of truths gathering beneath its roots. The tree's light is a beautiful lie, one crafted to illuminate the world only in ways that reinforce its order. But now, the Tarnished sees the shadows it hides, the cracks woven through its radiance. They feel the ache in every branch, the tension in every root. The Erdtree senses them too, though not in anger. It senses them with the wary curiosity of an ancient guardian confronted by a truth it cannot reconcile. For ages, the Golden Order had declared its perfection. It taught that all lives must fit into a divine design sculpted from Marika's will. It insisted that hierarchy was natural, that separation was sacred, that suffering was merely a flaw in mortal hearts. But as the Tarnished approaches the Erdtree, the flame within them swells with the memory of the merchants who were silenced beneath Leyndell, with the cries of mothers who lost their children to wars waged between gods, with the anguish of wanderers who died unseen in empty fields. The flame reveals that suffering was never a flaw. It was a silenced truth, a truth too immense for the Order to bear. And now, that truth walks directly into the heart of the world's authority. Hyetta follows behind, the Tarnished with steps as gentle as falling ash. Though she cannot see the Erdtree's towering majesty, she senses the trembling tension in its roots, feels the trembling emotions radiating from its sealed gate. Her hands stretch before her, palms open, as if feeling the warmth drifting from the Tarnished's form. She does not speak, for words seem too small for the moment unfolding, but the faint smile she wears hints at recognition. She has walked long under the weight of the flames, whispered truths, and now she stands at their threshold. As the Tarnished draws near the massive bark wall barring entry, the voices within them begin to rise in a soft, sorrowful chorus. This is not a command. It is a memory surfacing from the depths of collective emotion. The flame remembers the world before the Golden Order. It remembers freedom that did not require division. It remembers community forged not through law, but through vulnerability shared openly, without shame. The voices do not urge the Tarnished forward. They simply reveal the truth waiting at the boundary of existence, that unmaking is not destruction, it is release. The Golden Order senses this approach as a fracture in the structure of its reality. Invisible runes woven through the bark flicker erratically. Sigils meant to repel unworthy souls jolt like overburdened threads about to snap. Radagon's spectral presence, woven into the Erdtree's defences, stirs with agitation. Not because the Tarnished brings chaos, but because they bring a unity he cannot comprehend. Radagon, crafted by Marika as both consort and correction, was a being born from Order's desperate desire for coherence. He knows the logic of the runes intimately, feels every shift in their configuration, and now he feels them bending under the pressure of a truth they cannot contain. But the Tarnished, infused with frenzy's warmth, sees Radagon not as a foe awaiting confrontation. They see the sorrow etched into his existence, a sorrow born from being both himself and not himself. A sorrow woven into the duality that defined Marika's vision. They sense his internal fracture, the tension between obedience and selfhood. And in this recognition, the flame within them hums softly, extending compassion towards him as it does to all who carry wounds they never chose. What happens next is not a clash of power, though to an outside observer it may appear so. Radagon materializes in a cascade of golden fragments, his form manifesting in defiant brilliance. His staff gleams like crystallized lore, and his stance echoes every decree the Golden Order has ever made. He raises his weapon not from hatred, but from desperation, a last attempt to preserve the structure upon which his entire existence depends. Yet as the Tarnished steps forward, the flame does not lash out. It unfurls gently, like a hand reaching to comfort a trembling soul. Radagon hesitates, for he feels the emotion beneath the flame. He senses not malice, but a unity that threatens to dissolve the divine separation he was born to embody. His runes flare, but the flame's warmth passes through them, as though they were made of paper. The golden sigils splinter, unable to withstand the weight of countless sorrows seeking recognition. The moment Radagon falters, the Erdtree's bark wall trembles. Its surface ripples with luminous veins, each carrying a glow that falters as if overwhelmed by the presence of something older, deeper, truer. The Tarnished feels the tree's hesitation, a shudder of ancient uncertainty. The Erdtree was born from the greater will's desire for structure. It was crafted to enforce separation, to filter death, to refine identity, to maintain cosmic hierarchy. But it was never designed to withstand a force built entirely from unity. The Tarnished reaches out, their hand grazing the tree's sealed bark. The flame within them stirs, humming with soft intensity. The voices that fill their mind align into a single note, a resonance that vibrates through the tree's foundation. And slowly, impossibly, the bark begins to soften beneath their touch. Golden strands melt into crimson gold threads that unravel into the air like drifting embers. The barrier dissolves, not through force, but through understanding. The Erdtree cannot bar a truth that recognizes all suffering as one. Hyetta, standing just behind, gasps softly as the warmth intensifies around her. She feels the swell of emotion, the gentle unraveling of ancient structures, the quiet promise of a world no longer bound by solitary pain. Her voice trembles as she whispers, "This is the moment. The world waits for the flame you carry." Inside, where the heart of the Erdtree glows with the fading pulse of the Order, the Tarnished steps into a realm trembling between endings and beginnings. The roots around them pulse with memories of every soul ever touched by grace. They shimmer in golden arcs, attempting to maintain the integrity of a system breaking under its own weight. But the flame within the Tarnished reaches outward, weaving threads of crimson gold through the trembling light, offering release where the Order demands continuity. The frenzied flame does not roar. It sighs. It spreads gently, softly, like warmth rising from a fractured chest. It touches the Erdtree's heart not as conqueror, but as companion. It whispers to every fragment of grace, every rune, every memory, every boundary that once defined the world. And with each whisper, the world shifts. Not violently, not destructively, but with the vulnerable honesty of a soul laying itself bare. Hyetta steps forward, guided by the warmth radiating from the Tarnished, her breath catching as she feels the world's boundaries thinning around her. She senses the unity blooming, vast, overwhelming, tender. She senses the dissolution that will follow, not as doom, but as release. And in that trembling chamber where grace falters and unity rises, the flame awaits expression through the tarnished, awaits the moment when unmaking becomes the final act of compassion, when boundaries dissolve, when all sorrow becomes shared, when all solitude finally end.